There are certain jazz records you listen to once, enjoy, and then move on from. And then there are records that seem to follow you around. You hear them again a few weeks later, and then suddenly you notice something you didn't hear the first time around. A particular interaction between two musicians, a strange texture in the background, a melody that seemed almost incidental becomes the thing that you can't stop thinking about. And for me, that's one of the great things about ECM. The best ECM albums don't necessarily demand your attention. They invite you into their world. And once you're there, you keep discovering things. So in today's video, we're returning to my series on my favorite ECM albums, and I've got 5 more records that I find absolutely incredible. We've got a great selection of different musicians. There will be some familiar names, but each one of these albums creates a very different musical landscape. So if you're interested in ECM, or you're simply looking for some beautifully recorded, atmospheric and adventurous jazz, stay with me because I think there are some real gems in this selection. This is part 4 of my ECM series. Let's get started. Let's begin with Kenny Wheeler's album Dear One, released in 1978. Kenny Wheeler is one of those musicians whose playing seems almost perfectly suited to the ECM environment. On this album, Wheeler is on trumpet and flugelhorn, and he's joined by Garbarek on tenor and soprano saxophones, John Abercrombie on electric guitar and electric mandolin, Dave Holland on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. And on track 2, we also get Ralph Towner on a 12-string guitar. Now just looking at that lineup gives you a pretty good indication that this isn't going to just be a conventional small group jazz album. You've got trumpet and saxophone at the front, but you've also got electric guitar, electric mandolin, 12-string guitar, bass and drums. There's a huge amount of potential for different textures, and that's one of the things I love about Dear One. It doesn't feel like the musicians are simply taking turns playing solos over the rhythm section. There's a much stronger sense of the entire group contributing to the sound. Wheeler's trumpet and flugelhorn playing provides this wonderfully distinctive center of gravity. There's a lyrical quality to his sound, but there's also something mysterious about it. And then you've got Garbarek. If you've listened to much ECM, you'll know just how recognizable Garbarek's sound can be. His saxophone playing can be intensely lyrical, but there's often an incredible amount of space around the notes. And that becomes particularly interesting when you put him alongside Wheeler. Rather than simply competing for your attention, their instruments can seem to occupy different parts of the same musical landscape. Then there's John Abercrombie. His electric guitar adds another dimension entirely, and I think this is a really good example of why the ECM catalogue is so fascinating. The electric guitar doesn't necessarily make the music feel more aggressive or conventional. Instead, it becomes another colour. And behind all of this, you've got Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette. That's quite a rhythm section. Holland is such a strong presence on bass, while DeJohnette has the ability to respond to what's happening around him, rather than providing a predictable rhythmic foundation. My favourite track on the album is Peace for 5, and this is one of those tracks where I think it's worth giving yourself the time to properly settle into the music. Don't necessarily listen to it while doing 10 other things. Put it on, turn it up a little, and actually listen to the interaction happening between the musicians. For me, that's where the magic of Dear One really comes alive. It's an album that rewards attention, but it doesn't feel like hard work. And that's a combination I really value in jazz. You can simply enjoy the sound, but if you want to listen more deeply, there's plenty there waiting for you. Kenny Wheeler, Dear One, That's album number 1. Next up, we're going back a couple of years to 1976 with Art Lande's Rubisa Patrol. The musicians here are Art Lande on piano, Mark Isham on trumpet, flugelhorn and soprano saxophone, Bill Douglas on bass, flute and kazoo, and Glenn Cronkite on drums and percussion. And I think this is a really interesting album to put alongside Dear One, because although there are some similarities in terms of overall ECM atmosphere, Rubisa Patrol has a character of its own. One of the first things that stands out to me is the instrumentation. You've got piano and trumpet, of course, but then you've got flute and kazoo alongside bass, drums and percussion. So already you're dealing with a palette that goes beyond what you might expect from a conventional piano-led jazz group. And that's something I really enjoy about this period of ECM. There's a sense of experimentation, but it doesn't feel experimental for the sake of being experimental. The unusual sounds are incorporated into the music. They become part of the atmosphere. Art Lande is obviously central to the album, and the piano gives the music a strong melodic and harmonic foundation. Mark Isham's trumpet and flugelhorn bring a very different colour to the music, while the soprano saxophone gives him another voice altogether. And then you've got Bill Douglas contributing not just bass, but also flute and kazoo. That kind of multi-instrumental approach is one of those details that can make you listen to an album differently once you know it's there. My favourite track is Romany. It's the track I'd point someone towards if they wanted to find out why I find Rubisa Patrol so appealing. But I think the important thing with this album is not to approach it expecting the kind of jazz where every track needs to announce itself immediately. There's something much more subtle going on. This is music where atmosphere matters. The spaces between things matter. The combination of instruments matters. And once again, that's something I associate strongly with the ECM sound. There's often a sense that the musicians are allowing the music to breathe, and I think that's particularly valuable today, when so much music is competing for our attention every second. Sometimes it's nice to put on an album that doesn't constantly shout at you. Rubisa Patrol is one of those records for me. It's an album I can return to and simply let unfold. And if you've never explored Art Lande's ECM recordings, this is certainly one I'd recommend spending some time with. Art Lande, Rubisa Patrol, that's number 2. Now we're moving on to Bill Connors and his 1977 album Of Mist and Melting. And this one features another fantastic lineup. Bill Connors on guitar, Jan Garbarek on saxophone, Gary Peacock on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. That's a 4-piece. And I think the relatively small lineup is important here, because it creates an enormous amount of space for the individual musicians. You've got guitar, saxophone, bass and drums. That's it. But of course, when the musicians are of this caliber, that's it is actually quite a lot. Bill Connors is the central voice on guitar, and one of the things I really enjoy about this album is hearing how the guitar interacts with Garbarek's saxophone. There's a natural contrast between the two instruments. The guitar can provide harmony, melody and texture, while the saxophone can float over the top of that sound or respond to it. And then you've got Gary Peacock on bass. Peacock was a master of making the bass feel like an active part of the conversation, rather than simply something holding everything together. And once again, Jack DeJohnette is on drums. If you're familiar with DeJohnette's work, you'll know that he can be incredibly responsive. He doesn't have to fill every available space. And that's crucial to music like this, because when you've got 4 musicians operating in this kind of environment, Every note matters. Every silence matters. Every change in dynamics can alter the atmosphere. My favorite track is Melting, and even the title of the album, Of Mist and Melting, seems to fit the kind of musical world that ECM was creating around this period. There's a sense of things appearing and disappearing. Textures emerge, interact, and then give way to something else. And that's one of the reasons why I find this album so compelling. It's not simply about the guitar playing or the saxophone playing or the rhythm section individually. It's about the way those elements combine. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about a lot of the best ECM records. If you focus on the question, who is playing the best solo, you might miss something. The real fascination can be in what happens between the musicians. Who's responding to whom? Who's leaving space? Who's changing the direction of the music? Who's creating atmosphere? That's where Of Mist and Melting really works for me. And if you're a fan of Jan Garbarek, Gary Peacock or Jack DeJohnette, there's obviously plenty of reasons to explore this album. But I'd also recommend it to anyone who enjoys jazz guitar and wants something that feels less conventional than a straightforward guitar-led jazz record. We're staying with Lande for our fourth album, but this time he's joined by Jan Garbarek. The album is Red Lanta, released in 1979, and this is probably the most stripped back recording in today's selection. Lande plays piano while Jan Garbarek plays soprano saxophone, bass saxophone and flutes. That's a remarkably small lineup. 2 musicians, piano and woodwinds. And yet somehow there's an enormous amount of room for expression. This is one of those albums that really demonstrates how powerful restraint can be. When there are only 2 musicians, you can't hide. Every interaction is exposed. There's nowhere for the music to disappear into a dense arrangement. And I think that's part of what makes Red Lanta so interesting. Lande's piano and Garbarek's instruments can seem to move around one another, sometimes creating a sense of dialogue, sometimes sounding almost like they're sharing the same musical thought. And Garbarek isn't restricted to simply playing tenor or soprano saxophone. He's also bringing flutes and bass saxophone into the picture. That expands the sonic palette considerably. And again, this is where I think ECM's approach to sound becomes so important. The instruments aren't merely there to perform a musical function. Their actual sound becomes part of the composition. The tone of an instrument, the amount of space around it, the relationship between one sound and another, those things become important. My favorite track is Awakening Midweek, and I think that's a great track to hear if you want to understand what I mean about the intimacy of this album. There's something very direct about hearing 2 musicians interact like this. It feels less like you're being presented with a finished musical object and more like you're being allowed into a conversation. And that's one of my favorite things about ECM records from this era. They can feel incredibly personal, not necessarily because the music is confessional, but because you can hear the individuality of the musicians so clearly. You hear the touch of the pianist, you hear the breath and tone of the saxophonist. You hear the spaces between phrases, and those details become part of the experience. So if you're someone who enjoys quieter, more intimate jazz, Red Lanta is definitely an album to investigate. And if you're already a fan of Lande or Jan Garbarek, I'd say it's particularly worth hearing. Red Lanta, that's number 4. And now we've reached the final album in today's selection. Our 5th and final album is Sargasso C by John Abercrombie and Ralph Towner. This was released in 1976. And I think this is a perfect album to finish with. Why? Because once again, we're dealing with a very small lineup. Just 2 musicians. John Abercrombie plays electric and acoustic guitar, while Ralph Towner plays 12-string and classical guitar as well as piano. And when you see that instrumentation, you might expect a straightforward guitar duet. But this doesn't really feel straightforward to me. The combination of Abercrombie and Towner creates a huge amount of sonic variety. You've got electric guitar alongside acoustic instruments. You've got 12-string guitar, you've got classical guitar, and you've got piano. So despite there only being 2 musicians, they've got a lot of different colours available to them. And I think that's one of the great strengths of Sargasso Sea. It feels spacious, but it doesn't feel empty. That's an important distinction. There's a lot of room in the music, but that room is being used. It's part of the sound, and that's something I've probably mentioned throughout this video, but it's worth mentioning because it's such a fundamental part of why these records work for me. Space isn't the absence of music. Space is part of the music, and on Sargasso Sea you can really hear that. John Abercrombie and Ralph Towner have an enormous amount of freedom to interact. Neither musician has to dominate the recording. They can complement each other, respond to each other, and leave space for the other person. My favourite track is Over and Gone, and it's the kind of track I think benefits enormously from focused listening. If you've got headphones, even better. Listen to the different guitar textures, listen to how instruments occupy different spaces, and listen to how the music doesn't need to be constantly busy to remain interesting. That's something I think a lot of modern listeners can sometimes forget. We're so accustomed to music being densely produced and constantly changing that listening to something with genuine space can sometimes feel unusual. But when it's done well, that space gives your ears somewhere to go. You can concentrate on one instrument and then another. You can hear the interaction. You can notice the small details, and you can simply enjoy the tone of the instruments. That's what Sargasso Sea gives me, and honestly, I think it's one of those albums that makes a really strong case for listening to jazz as an immersive experience rather than just background music. So, there we have it. 5 more ECM albums that I find incredible. And what's interesting to me is just how different these albums are, despite coming from the same label and broadly the same period. You've got large ensembles and intimate duets. You've got trumpet, saxophone, piano, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, 12-string guitar, flute, and some much more unusual instrumental colours. But there is a thread connecting them. For me, that thread is the importance of atmosphere, interaction, and space. These aren't albums I want to put on simply as background noise. They're records that reward listening. And that's one of the reasons I keep coming back to ECM. Be sure to leave a comment below letting me know which of these 5 albums you enjoy the most. Also, let me know an ECM album that you would recommend I listen to next. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date with my latest uploads. If you want to continue hanging out with me here on the channel, I'll pop a video in the corner for you to click on now. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.